Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, let me give you a quick rundown on what we're all about. Here at the Commander's Quarters, we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks. A focused commander deck is more tuned than a casual deck, but not quite to the level of a competitive or optimized deck. Today's episode is going to be a special one though, where we exclude the cost of the commander. With just a $25 budget, it's pretty much impossible to build around some commanders unless we do so. Sometimes you get lucky and open up a commander in a pack, or you could just trade for them if you really want to build around them. So our budget is still going to be $25, but again, that's $25 for just 99 cards because we're excluding the cost of that commander. And prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCGPLAYER. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. Today's episode is a patron-selected deck tech. Once a month, patrons of this show vote on what commander they'd like to see on an upcoming episode. And the commander that received the most votes for this deck tech was Queen Marchesa. She's a 3/3 human assassin that has Death Touch and Haste and costs 1 red, white, black. When she enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent is the Monarch, put a 1/1 black assassin creature token with Death Touch and Haste onto the battlefield. Currently, Queen Marchesa is the only commander that actually mentions the Monarch mechanic. Essentially, when you're the Monarch, at the beginning of your end step, you draw a card, but whenever a creature deals combat damage to you, its controller becomes the Monarch. Having the source of additional card advantage is great, especially from our commander. But by becoming the Monarch, we definitely put a target on our back because other players want to take it from us. If one of our opponents does take it from us, we can try to get it back with either Marchesa or our assassin token, both of which have Death Touch and Haste. But once we become the Monarch, ideally we want to keep it for the rest of the game. So our strategy for this deck is very straightforward. We want to become the Monarch and control the board. We're going to be running plenty of board wipes in this deck because again, our commander doesn't have to stick around in order for us to stay the Monarch, she just has to hit the battlefield once. And if we lose Monarch, we can actually get it back in multiple ways. We can either deal combat damage to the player that has it, or we can just make sure that Marchesa enters the battlefield again. And then how do we win with this deck? Well, we're going to gain value from wrathing the board continuously. So with our wraths, we're not only going to set our opponents back, but we're also going to put ourselves ahead. So as long as we can control the board, we can outvalue our opponents and win. As with all Commander's Quarters decks, I'm going to break this deck down into 10 different tactics that show you how the deck works and how you're going to win with it. So let's go into our first tactic. Tactic number 1, Royal Rocks. First up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which we can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice it to search our library for a basic land and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And then there's Prismatic Lens, which can tap for a colorless or can filter our mana. Next up is Fear of the Suns, which enters the battlefield tapped, but it can tap for 1 mana of any color 3 times. And Star Compass also enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap for any of our colors depending on our land situation. Next up, we're going to be running Marble Diamond, which enters the battlefield tapped and taps for a white. And then we're running 2 of the Signets with Orzhov and Boros, both of which we can pay 1 into and tap them for their guild's colors. Finally, we're going to be running Orzhov, Rakdos, and Boros Locket, each of which can tap for 1 of their guild's colors. On top of that, we can pay 4 of their guild colors and tap and sacrifice them to draw 2 cards. Ramping is important for this deck, and with the right hand, we can get our commander out on turn 3. But we don't always want to rush our commander out there, and we have to read the situation to make sure that we can protect ourselves. So sometimes we want to clear the board even before we get our commander out, and sometimes after. Regardless of when we're casting them, we're running a ton of board wipes in this deck. Let's go through them now in tactic number 2, Wrath of Royalty. First up, we're going to be running Citywide Bust, Slaughter the Strong, and Divine Reckoning, each of which we can cast early and still leave our commander on the board. Citywide Bust is going to destroy all creatures with toughness 4 or greater. Slaughter the Strong is somewhat similar, but it can be much more powerful. It says each player chooses any number of creatures he or she controls with total power of 4 or less, then sacrifices all of the creatures he or she controls. So this ensures that all of our opponents lose every single creature they have that has a power of 5 or greater, and usually they only get to keep 1 or 2 of their weaker creatures around. Since this makes our opponents actually sacrifice those creatures, it gets around indestructible. Next up, there's Divine Reckoning, which doesn't get around indestructible, but it's still very effective. It makes each player choose 1 creature they control, and then the rest are destroyed. On top of that, we can flash it back for 5 white. Again, this is a great effect because again, it keeps our commander on the board while decimating our opponents. And then we're going to be running Sublime Exhalation, which is a good standard board wiping commander. It has Undaunted, so generally this is going to cost us 4 mana, and it says destroy all creatures. Keeping our commander on the battlefield is nice, but sometimes it's not necessary. So we're also going to be running some more board wipes like Planar Outburst, End Hostilities, and Winds of Wrath. Planar Outburst is going to destroy all non-land creatures. End Hostilities destroys all creatures and all permanents attached to creatures. And Winds of Wrath destroys all creatures that aren't enchanted and they can't be regenerated. Each of these are basically 5 mana wraths that have some additional effects that don't always come into play but are good budget options. Next up, we've got some more impactful wraths with Tragic Arrogance. It says, for each player you choose from among the permanents that player controls an artifact, a creature, an enchantment, and a planeswalker, then each player sacrifices all other non-land permanents they control. Essentially, this this allows us to make everyone sacrifice their best permanents. And then Hallowed Burial says put all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries. This is an amazing wrath because it gets around indestructibility and it also doesn't give our opponents death triggers. Descend Upon the Sinful also has those advantages because it says exile all creatures. On top of that, if we happen to have Delirium, we're going to get a 4/4 Angel. And then we're running Kurtar's Wrath, which says destroy all creatures that can't be regenerated. If we happen to have Threshold, then we get 2/1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. Next there's Phyrexian Rebirth, which says destroy all creatures, then create an XX colorless horror artifact creature token where X is the number of creatures destroyed this way. This way is a bit more dependable than Kurtar's Wrath because it guarantees that we get that token. Depending on the board state when we cast this can actually be a big threat. And we can use it as a blocker or as an attacker to try to get Monarch back. And finally we've got two what can be very one-sided board wipes with Mass Calcify and Volcanic Vision. Mass Calcify is going to destroy all non-white creatures. And then Volcanic Vision says return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. Volcanic Vision deals damage equal to that card's converted mana cost to each creature your opponents control. Exile Volcanic Vision. This card is fantastic in this deck because not only can it get us back another board wipe, but it also is a board wipe in itself. But we've got more ways than just board wipes to protect ourselves. So let's go through some more now in tactic number 3, Assured Destruction. First up, we're going to be running Hissing Miasma, Blood Reckoning, and Marchesa's Decree, each of which pretty much does the exact same thing. They have whenever a creature attacks you, its controller loses 1 life. These are fantastic ways to deter opponents from actually wanting to attack us. The later the game goes and the lower that life totals get, the harder it is for opponents to justify actually swinging our way. On top of that, Marchesa's Decree makes us the Monarch when it comes into play. So this can definitely save us from having to cast or recast our commander. Next up there's Mystic Barrier, which is a fantastic card in this deck. When it enters the battlefield or at the beginning of our upkeep, we choose left or right. And then each player may attack only the opponent seated nearest to them in the last chosen direction and planeswalkers controlled by that player. This prevents us from being attacked by any player except for the one on either our right or our left. So if the player on our left has the most powerful board, we can choose left so that they can't attack us. This makes it so that we only have to worry about the player on our right and controlling their board. So as long as we can keep that player in check, we're going to keep the Monarch. And finally, we're going to be running Chronomatic Escape, which says, until your next turn, creatures can't attack you. Remove Chronomatic Escape from the game with 3 time counters on it. Essentially, this makes it so that every 3 turns, players can't attack us. This is a great spell for this deck because it can help us save up on our wraths. But our commander isn't helpless, and actually she can help us protect ourselves too. Let's go through some ways that she can do that in tactic number 4, Deathbringer. First up, we're going to be running Bladed Pinions, which is going to give flying and first strike. Now, while this might not seem like much, it does work very well with our commander. Marchesa already has Death Touch, so giving her first strike essentially means that whenever she blocks a creature, that creature dies and she doesn't. And since this also gives her flying, she can deal with any pesky flyers too. Our opponents aren't going to have many creatures on the board because we're going to continuously wrath it. That makes it even harder for them to justify swinging at us when they know that they're going to lose a creature. So we're also going to be running Peregrine Mask, which does the exact same thing, but it also gives her Defender. Now this isn't ideal for us, but most of the time we don't need to swing with her to actually get Monarch back. We can make her enter the battlefield again, or we can just swing with our Assassin. But what are some ways that we can make her enter the battlefield again? Let's go through them now in tactic number 5, Queen's Retreat. First up, there's Voyager Staff, which we can pay 2 and sacrifice it to exile target creature and return the exile card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This is a very flexible card in this deck, and we can use it in a wide variety of ways. It can be used to get Monarch back with Marchesa. We can save her from a board wipe or from targeted removal. We can even use it on one of our opponent's creatures to make sure that they don't hit us. And then we're running Synod Sanctum, which we have to be a little more careful with. We can pay 2 and tap it to exile target permanent we control. And then we can pay 2 to sacrifice it to return all cards exiled with it to the battlefield under our control. So in an ideal situation, we can exile Marchesa with this and then get her back when we need her. The problem is that if our opponents destroy this and we don't have the mana to sacrifice it, she's going to be lost forever. This can be a very effective card in this deck, but you need to make sure that you play it safe and have that mana ready. Finally, we're going to be running Umbilicus, which says at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player returns a permanent they control to their hand unless they pay 2 life. Returning Marchesa back to our hand is not a bad thing. And since we're going to be blowing up the board a lot, our opponents aren't going to have a lot of things that they want back in their hand. This card serves a dual purpose for this deck. It both helps us and it hurts our opponents. But these aren't the only ways for us to get Marchesa back. So let's go through some more in tactic number 6, Death is the Beginning. First up, there's Undying Evil, Supernatural Stamina, and Abnormal Endurance, each of which pretty much do the exact same thing in this deck. Essentially, they make it so that once Marchesa dies, she comes right back. If one of our opponents is trying to kill her, or if one of our own board wipes is going to take her out, we can just cast one of these to make sure that we get her back. And then we've got some more flexible auras with Unhallowed Pack and Shades Form, each of which says when enchanted creature dies, return that card to the battlefield under your control. So we can use these ahead of time on Marchesa to get her back if she's going to die. Or we can use these to gain control of one of our opponent's best creatures. By simply putting this on our opponent's creature and wiping the board, we get that creature when it dies. And finally, we're going to be running Demonic Vigor and No Rest for the Wicked, both of which are going to get Marchesa back to our hand when she dies. So if we're just going to continue to wipe the board, sometimes it's actually better if Marchesa's in our hand. So we've talked about gaining control of some of our opponent's threats, but how do we deal with their other threats? Let's go through some ways now in tactic number 7, Law and Order. First up, there's Oblivion Ring, which says when it enters the battlefield, exile another target non-land permanent, and when it leaves the battlefield, return that exiled card to the battlefield under its owner's control. Banishing Light is similar, but it's only for an opponent's non-land permanent. These are both great ways for us to deal with pretty much any threat that our opponents can throw at us. Next up is Rakdos Charm, which is a very flexible card in this stack. It says choose 1, exile all cards from target player's graveyard, destroy target artifact, or each creature deals 1 damage to its controller. All 3 of these modes are very relevant in Commander. Exiling someone's graveyard can really hose a graveyard strategy. Destroying an artifact is always going to be useful. And that third mode can be game ending against a token deck. Now while that mode can finish off some players, it can't finish off everyone. So we need some ways to dig for more board wipes and win conditions with this deck. So let's go through some ways now in tactic number 8, Pain and Gain. First up, there's Sign in Blood, which is going to make target player draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. And then Read the Bones is going to let us scry 2 first, then draw those 2 cards and lose 2 life. Next up, there's Dark Bargain, which at instant speed lets us look at the top 3 cards of our library, 2 of those go into our hand, 1 goes into our graveyard, and it deals 2 damage to us. 1 life for 1 card is pretty much always going to be a good rate in Commander. So we're also going to be running Painful Truths, which says you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of colors of mana spent to cast Painful Truths. If we have all of our colors, this is a fantastic rate for 3 cards. And then Ancient Craving and Ambition's Cost are both going to let us draw 3 cards and lose 3 life for 4 mana. Next up, there's Siphon Mine, which is a fantastic card in Commander. As long as all of our opponents are alive, it's going to let us draw 3 cards and each other player has to discard a card. And then we're running Moonlight Bargain, which is a fantastic instant speed draw spell. It says look at the top 5 cards of your library. For each card, put that card into your graveyard unless you pay 2 life, then put the rest into your hand. So this lets us dig a little deeper and lets us choose the right cards that we need. And finally, we're running Necrologia, which can let us dig deeper than any of our other draw spells. It's an instant, but we can only cast it during our end step. And as an additional cost to cast it, we have to pay X life, but we get to draw X cards. This is a great way for us to refill our hand when we need to. But sometimes we don't need a lot of cards, we just need one specific card. Let's go through some ways to find that specific card in tactic number 9, Royal Decree. First up, there's Diabolic Tutor, which lets us search our library for any card and put that card into our hand. And then Razaketh's Right does the exact same thing, but we can also cycle it for a black if we don't need it. Both of these tutors can come in really handy though by getting us a board wipe or by getting us one of our win conditions if we need it. But what are those cards that can help us win? Let's go through them in our final tactic. Tactic number 10, Execution Order. First up, there's Havoc Festival, which says players can't gain life. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player loses half of his or her life rounded up. When we have a decent life total and a good control of the board, this is a fantastic card. It's a clock that hits our opponents first before it hits us. But we do have to be very careful because when we play this, we have to know that we can control the board. And then there's Approach of the Second Sun, which is a fantastic alternative win condition. When we cast this the first time, we're going to put it back into our library 7th from the top and we gain 7 life. And then when we cast this from our hand the second time, we win the game. This deck is not only great at keeping the board clear and keeping us alive, but it can also dig deep for some cards. Next up is Mob Rule, which says choose 1. Gain control of all creatures with power 4 or greater until end of turn. Untap those creatures that gain haste until end of turn. Or gain control of all creatures with power 3 or less until end of turn. Untap those creatures that gain haste until end of turn. This is a fantastic finisher in a lot of red decks, even ones that want to wipe the board. Since we have other ways to prevent our opponents from attacking us, we don't always have to wipe the board. If we have this in our hand, we can hold off on casting a Wrath to make sure that our opponents can actually build up some of their creatures. And later on in the game, they're going to be playing some pretty big threats, so that first mode comes in handy. Gaining control of all of our opponent's best creatures can usually finish them all off at once or at least 1 or 2. And then we've got some more permanent ways to gain control of opponent's creatures with Profane Procession and Grave Betrayal. With Profane Procession, we can pay 3 white black to exile target creature, then if there are 3 or more cards exiled with Profane Procession, we transform it. It transforms into Tomb of the Dusk Rose. We can tap it to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool, or we can pay 2 white black and tap it to put a creature card exiled with this permanent onto the battlefield under your control. So not only can this help us remove some of our opponent's best creatures, but it can also give us them too once it flips. But Grave Betrayal does this in an even bigger way for this stack. It says whenever a creature you don't control dies, return it to the battlefield under your control with an additional +1/+1 counter on it at the beginning of the next end step. That creature is a black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. Essentially, with this out, every single time we wipe the board, we gain control of all of our opponent's creatures. Another way to finish off our opponents is with something like Dingus Staff. It says whenever a creature dies, Dingus Staff deals 2 damage to that creature's controller. So on top of losing their creatures, our opponents also get damaged by our board wipes. While this can be a very powerful effect, it's still not the Golden Pig of the deck. The Golden Pig is going to be the number 1 card out of our 99. And the Golden Pig for this deck is Vicious Shadows. Vicious Shadows is an enchantment that costs 6 and a red. It says whenever a creature dies, you may have Vicious Shadows deal damage to target player equal to the number of cards in that player's hand. This is an absolutely brutal effect for a lot of reasons. While Dingus Staff damages the player that lost the creature, this lets us choose. So when we wipe the board, we can choose to put all the damage on one player if we want to. It also puts our opponents in a very tough situation. If they choose not to play creature spells, they're just going to be building up more and more cards in their hand. When they do that, they become an even bigger target for us once creatures die. They can also choose to cast all their spells so that they actually don't have a hand. But that can actually hurt them even more because they're going to have to top deck for an answer. This card is absolutely detrimental to all of our opponents. It makes it very hard for our opponents to know if they're making the right decision or not. One of them might hold back from playing creatures and another might just play all theirs at once. This is an extremely powerful card that can not only throw a wrench into our opponent's plans but can finish them off too. And that's what makes it the Golden Pig. But now that we've gone through the cards that help us win with this deck, let's go through the cards that help make it happen. It's time to go on to the mana base. First up, there's Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sacrifice to search our library for a basic land and put into play tapped. And then there's Warp Landscape, which does the exact same thing but for 2 mana, and it can also tap for a colorless. Next up, there's Nomad Outpost, which enters the battlefield tapped. It can tap for any of our colors. And then there's Tainted Field, which can tap for a colorless, or we can tap for either a white or black mana if we control a swamp. Next up is Forsaken Sanctuary, Orzhov Guildgate, and Scoured Barrens, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a white or black mana. On top of that, Scoured Barrens is going to gain us 1 life when it comes into play. And then we're running Urborg Volcano, Rakdos Guildgate, Cinder Barrens, Bloodfell Caves, and Akuum Refuge, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a black or red mana. Bloodfell Caves and Akuum Refuge also will gain us 1 life when they come into play. Next up there's Stone Quarry, Boros Guildgate, and Windscarred Crag, each of which enter the battlefield tapped and tap for either a red or white mana. On top of that, Windscarred Crag is going to gain us 1 life when it comes into play. And then we're running Vivid Marsh, Vivid Meadow, and Vivid Crag. Each of these are going to enter the battlefield tapped with 2 charge counters on them and can tap for 1 of our colors. Or we can tap them to remove a charge counter from them to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And finally, we're going to be running 18 basic lands. 8 of those are going to be swamps, 8 will be plains, and 2 will be mountains. And now that we've gone through every single card in this deck, let's do a quick price check. A quick reminder that our deck costs are calculated using TCGPLAYER optimization, optimizing with even heavily played and damaged cards because those cards need a home too. The average Queen Marchesa EDHREC deck is going to set you back $374.65. Let's see what we compare to that. Our deck is going to be much more affordable, coming in at just $24.96. And just a quick reminder that our deck cost actually doesn't include our commander because it is a commander excluded episode. Again, Commander's Quarters decks are built to be tuned and focused within their budget, but there are always ways that we can improve on them. So let's go through some reasonable upgrades that you can add into the deck and what I would take out for those cards too. Just a quick disclaimer before we get into this, these reasonable upgrades are going to be completely based off of my own perspective. When you're making choices on how to adjust your deck, you're taking your own playstyle and meta into account. So make sure that you factor that in when it comes to making your own decisions on what to swap in and what to swap out. Now that we're on the same page, let's go through how I personally would upgrade the deck. First up, we're going to be upgrading this deck by adding in Delaying Shield, which comes in at $2.54. It's an enchantment that costs 3 and a white, and it says, if damage would be dealt to you, put that many delay counters on Delaying Shield instead. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove all delay counters from Delaying Shield. For each delay counter removed this way, you lose 1 life unless you pay 1 and a white. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Mass Calcify. Delaying Shield is a fantastic way for us to pretty much guarantee that we get to keep Monarch. Essentially, this prevents our opponents from actually dealing any combat damage to us. At the beginning of our upkeep, we still lose life for those delay counters, but that's not considered combat damage. So essentially with this in play, our opponents can't become the Monarch unless they have a card that specifically says you become the Monarch. Mass Calcify is a decent card, and in the right situation, it can be a fantastic Wrath. But if our opponents have a lot of white creatures on the board, it's basically useless. And then let's upgrade this deck by adding in Chandra's Ignition, which comes in at $4.12. It's a sorcery that costs 3 red, and it says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Kurtar's Wrath. This card is especially effective with Marchesa because she has Death Touch. Essentially, this makes it so that every other creature dies and each opponent takes 3 damage. Kurtar's Wrath is another Wrath that's just a bit too expensive for what it does. And most of the time, we can't depend on having Threshold to get those 2 spirits. Next up, let's upgrade this deck by adding in Norn's Annex, which comes in at $6.31. It's an artifact that costs 3 Phyrexian white. It says creatures can attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays Phyrexian white for each of those creatures. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Blood Reckoning. Norn's Annex is a fantastic way to deter attacks from opponents. They either have to pay a white mana or 2 life to attack us with any creature. Also, if we're willing to pay 4 life, we can even cast this for 3 mana. Blood Reckoning is a decent card, but Norn's Annex is just pretty much better in every single way. And then let's upgrade this deck by adding in Ghostly Prison, which costs $5.19. It's an enchantment that costs 2 and a white, and it says creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature he or she controls that's attacking you. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Peregrine Mask. Ghostly Prison is one of the most effective ways in Commander at deterring attacks. Peregrine Mask can be good, but can also be a bit too situational, whereas Ghostly Prison is good in pretty much any situation. Next up, we're going to be adding in Sphere of Safety, which comes in at $2.21. It's an enchantment that costs 4 and a white. It says creatures can attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays X for each of those creatures, where X is the number of enchantments you control. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Bladed Pinions. Sphere of Safety can be even more effective than Ghostly Prison when it comes to deterring attacks. And like Peregrine Mask, Bladed Pinions can just be too situational. Finally, let's upgrade this deck by adding in Debtor's Knell, which comes in at $3.39. It's an enchantment that costs 4 Hybrid Orzhov. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, put target creature card in a graveyard into play under your control. To put this in, we're going to be taking out Havoc Festival. With this deck, we're going to destroy a ton of creatures. Debtor's Knell lets us get the best of those creatures each turn back into play under our control. If we're ahead, Havoc Festival is great, but if we're behind, it's unplayable. So swapping this out for Debtor's Knell is an easy call. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCGPLAYER, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.